Did you know more than 3 million people were killed during the Vietnam War? And half of the 3 million people were Vietnamese civilians, according to History.com? Good morning. My name is Matthew, and I'm here today to talk to you about the Vietnam War. Now, there is so much information about the Vietnam War that I will not be able to cover all of it. But what I will be going over this morning is first, I'm going to talk about the background of the war. Specifically, how the war started and what happened at the Geneva Conventions in 1954. Then I'm going to talk about how the United States became involved in the war, specifically what the domino theory is and how the war ended. Now that you know what I'll be going over this morning, let's jump right in and talk about the background of the war. So how did Vietnam start? Well, it started back in the 1800s when France first invaded Vietnam. And then, fast forward to World War II, Japan invaded Vietnam. So now you had France and Japan fighting over Vietnam. And then while this was going on, a revolutionary leader named Ho Chi Minh, who was a communist supporter, created the Viet Minh. And his goal was to get rid of France and Japanese occupiers. Japan withdrew its forces in 1945 and left a French-educated emperor, Bo Dai, in control of an independent Vietnam. And then Ho Chi Minh's forces seized the city of Hanoi, declaring a Democratic Republic of Vietnam, with Ho Chi Minh as president, according to History1900s.com. So now you had North and South Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh and Bo Dai, until a decisive battle at Dien Bien Phu in May 1954, which ended in French defeat. At the Geneva Conventions in 1954, an agreement came out. First you had the ceasefire part, which let France withdraw its forces, and then the second part was it split Vietnam into two at the 17th parallel, with North up top, Ho Chi Minh, and Bo Dai in the south, split right in the middle at the 17th parallel, according to History.com. Bo Dai was later pushed aside for Ngo Dinh Diem, who was strongly anti-communist. Diem was later killed in 1963, and his communist supporters in South Vietnam during his tenure created the Viet Cong, who used guerrilla warfare on the South Vietnamese. Now that you know about the background of the Vietnam War, let's talk about how the United States became involved in the war. The United States became involved in the war because of the domino theory. The domino theory stated that if one country fell in Southeast Asia to communism, then the surrounding countries would fall to communism, according to History1900s.com. So the United States wanted to stop the spread of communism, so they decided to help France by sending military aid back in 1950. The first ground troops didn't arrive in Vietnam until March 1965, and that was only because of the Gulf of Tonkin incident. The Gulf of Tonkin incident was when North Vietnam fired at 2 U.S. ships in international waters. When the ground troops arrived, they fought a difficult jungle war against a well-supplied enemy who hid in tunnels and brush. The enemy attacked in ambushes and set booby traps, and this only frustrated the United States soldiers. The United States used Agent Orange and napalm to clear the areas. And then on January 30, 1968, North Vietnam surprised both the United States and South Vietnam by invading over 100 South Vietnam cities and towns, known as the Tet Offensive. This was the turning point in the war. The war lasted many years, from 1800s all the way to 1970s. So President Nixon outlined a plan called Vietnamization, which basically stated a process to remove the United States troops by handing back the fighting to South Vietnam, according to History1900s.com. But before this happened, President Nixon expanded the war to Laos and Cambodia to disrupt the North Vietnam supply bases. This violated international law and sparked protests across America. Withdrawal of the United States troops began on July 1969. And then after most of our troops were gone, North Vietnam launched another massive assault known as the Easter Offensive on July 30, 1972. And then North Vietnam crossed the demilitarized zone at the 17th parallel and invaded South Vietnam. The last of our troops were gone in March 29, 1973, but the fighting between the North and the South continued. And then the South Vietnam officially surrendered to the Communist North on April 30th, 1975. And then on July 2nd, 1976, Vietnam was unified as a communist country, the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. The United States spent over $120 billion on this war. And then in 1982, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial was unveiled in Washington, D.C., with the names of more than 58,200 American forces killed or missing during the war. Now that you have learned about the United States, how they became involved in the war, let's go over what I have briefed this morning. During the brief, I talked about the background of the Vietnam War. I talked about what happened at the Geneva Conventions and how the war started. And then I went over why the United States became involved in the war. I talked about the domino theory and how the war ended. I hope after this briefing you know more about the background of the war and why the United States became involved in the war. The United States got involved in Vietnam because of the domino theory. And out of all of Southeast Asia, only Laos and Cambodia fell to communism. If you have any questions or comments, I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you.